You have felt it before. That burning that starts somewhere in the middle and doesn't stop. It keeps you awake at 3 in the morning. It follows you through meals, through meetings, through years. The human stomach produces hydrochloric acid strong enough to dissolve metal. Nothing lives there, nothing can live there. This was not a theory, it was not a hypothesis. It was one of the most basic facts in all of medicine. It was taught in every medical school on earth. It was true, it was obvious, it was settled. By the late 1970s, medicine had answers. Tagamet, Zantac, a new generation of drugs that suppress stomach acid. They worked. Patients felt better. The pain receded. Tagamet became one of the first drugs in history to reach $1 billion in annual sales. Zantac would surpass $3 billion. The total ulcer drug market, $5 billion a year. The cause of ulcers was known: stress, coffee, spicy food, anxiety, a hard life. The treatment was management, not cure. You took the medication every day for the rest of your life. Doctors were honest about this. Ulcers were chronic. You learned to live with them. In 1979, a pathologist in Perth, Western Australia, looked through a microscope at a stomach biopsy and saw something that wasn't supposed to be there. Robin Warren was not looking for anything unusual. He was a pathologist, a man whose work was to look at tissue samples and describe what he saw. He was methodical, he was precise. He was, by his own description, unremarkable. There they were, curved, corkscrew-shaped bacteria living in the stomach lining of a patient with gastritis, in a place where nothing was supposed to live. He looked at more samples, more bacteria, always in the inflamed tissue, always associated with the damage. The more inflammation, the more bacteria. The pattern was consistent, systematic, impossible to ignore. He reported it to his colleagues. They were polite. The stomach is sterile. You're seeing laboratory artifacts. Warren went back to his microscope. He kept collecting samples. For 2 years, he worked alone. In 1981, a young medical resident named Barry Marshall was looking for a research project. Someone pointed him toward the quiet pathologist with the curious slides. "There's something here," he said. Warren nodded slowly. "I know," he said. "I've been waiting for someone to agree." Together, they began a systematic study. 100 patients. Every patient who came through the endoscopy unit. 77% of patients with stomach ulcers carried the bacteria. Every single patient with duodenal ulcers carried it. Every one. The first successful culture had come by accident. It was Easter weekend, 1982. The lab was empty. The culture plates had been left incubating longer than protocol. No one was there to check them. When the team returned, the slow-growing bacteria had finally appeared. What routine would have discarded, accident had preserved. In 1983, Marshall submitted their paper to the Gastroenterological Society of Australia. It was rejected, classified in the bottom 10th of all papers received that year. He watched patients have their stomachs surgically removed. He watched people spend their lives managing a condition he believed could be cured in 2 weeks. He had been arguing with the skeptics for 2 years. He was 32 years old, and he was running out of patience. On a Tuesday morning in July 1984, Barry Marshall walked into his lab at Fremantle Hospital. He had not told the hospital ethics committee. He had not told his superiors. He had not told his wife. He asked his lab technician to prepare a solution. The technician scraped the contents of 2 Petri dishes into a small beaker of beef broth. Inside those dishes, approximately 1 billion Helicobacter pylori bacteria, cultured from a 66-year-old patient with severe indigestion. He picked up the beaker, He later described the taste as swamp water. He swallowed it quickly, like a shot. Then he went back to work. Day 1, day 2. Nothing. Day 3. His wife noticed it first. His mother noticed it second. His breath was, in their words, putrid. Day 5. He woke before dawn and vomited. Clear, watery liquid, no acid. The bacteria had already begun eliminating the cells that produce stomach acid. His stomach was no longer his. Day 8. Endoscopy. The tissue showed massive inflammation. Biopsies revealed H. pylori had colonized his stomach completely. He was right. He had always been right. He had the endoscopy images to prove it. On day 14, he finally told his wife what he had done. She ordered him to begin antibiotics immediately. The final endoscopy showed a completely healthy stomach. Koch's postulates had been fulfilled. The proof was made. A man had infected himself with 1 billion bacteria, developed gastritis, and cured himself with antibiotics. For legal reasons, the paper referred to the subject simply as a male volunteer. The medical community noted the experiment and continued largely to disagree. By the mid-1980s, the ulcer drug market was worth $5 billion a year. Tagamet and Zantac were two of the best-selling drugs in human history. They did not cure ulcers, they managed them. A managed patient is a patient who returns every month. A cured patient is a patient who doesn't. It would be satisfying to locate a villain here. A conspiracy, a suppressed cure, a cover-up. The truth is more uncomfortable than that. The doctors who rejected Marshall were not corrupt. They were applying the scientific standard. They had been trained to apply. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Every medical and microbiology textbook stated that the stomach was sterile. Nobody had thought to culture a stomach biopsy because everyone already knew what they would find. Nothing. Marshall moved to the United States. He expanded his data. By the end of 1984, he had treated hundreds of patients with bismuth and antibiotics. He cured most of them in 2 weeks, permanently. Local physicians began sending him patients with so-called psychosomatic gastric symptoms. Patients who had been told for years that their pain was in their heads. It was not in their heads. On February 9, 1994, the National Institutes of Health convened a consensus panel in Washington. 22 researchers. The question, what causes peptic ulcers? The conclusion, after decades of resistance, H. pylori was the primary cause. Antibiotics were the correct treatment. Between 1993 and 1996, American clinical practice changed completely. Peptic ulcer disease went from a chronic, disabling condition to an infection curable in 2 weeks. In Australia alone, the healthcare savings were estimated at $300 million a year. In 2005, the Nobel Committee awarded the prize in physiology or medicine to Barry Marshall and Robin Warren for their discovery of the bacterium Helicobacter pylori and its role in gastritis and peptic ulcer disease. Warren and Marshall were at a pub when they heard beer and fish and chips in Perth, the most isolated city in the world. Today, H. pylori is the most common chronic infection on Earth. It infects half the world's population. In the world's poorest countries, it is nearly universal. And H. pylori doesn't only cause ulcers. It is now an established cause of gastric cancer, the third leading cause of cancer death worldwide. Most of those cancers are, in theory, preventable with a 2-week course of antibiotics. Here is what nobody told you. The idea that bacteria cause stomach disease was first proposed in 1879 by a Polish gastroenterologist named Walery Jaworski. He was ignored. For 100 years, the idea returned periodically. And was dismissed each time. The bacterium was always there, in every biopsy, in every inflamed stomach, waiting to be found. For a century, no one looked, because everyone already knew the answer. Barry Marshall once asked himself a question that has no comfortable answer. How many other diseases, the ones we currently blame on stress, on diet, on bad genes, on aging, how many of them have a simple bacterial cause that nobody has thought to look for? The answer may already be in a petri dish somewhere, waiting for someone who is willing to drink the swamp water. There is always a moment before we knew. This is before we knew. If this episode made you want to know more, we recommend going deeper